Thank you. Welcome to this is the May 2018 Policy Speaker Series from NASA's Carbon Research Program. Today we have Lisa Hanle. She's the director of the MRV support program for the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. Before that, she was at the EPA and she was also at the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention in Germany. The title of the talk is Building the People and the Institutions to Make the World Paris Ready. This talk will introduce some of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute's key programs and activities designed to train a global community of greenhouse gas professionals and focusing on the strategies to enhance the effectiveness of capacity building interventions. So Lisa's talk and the visit here to Goddard intends to initiate a discussion on how remote sensing could contribute to the improvement of MRV systems in developed and developing countries to improve the accuracy of greenhouse gas inventories and the ability to track implementation of nationally determined contributions, as well as identify potential collaborations between her organization and NASA carbon scientists. Just so you have an idea, some of the research and interest areas of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute and that Lisa may be talking more about in her talk are greenhouse gas inventories, greenhouse gas mitigation and management, greenhouse gas verification, greenhouse gas project level accounting, and that includes carbon offsets, gas flaring and methane management, and capacity building efforts. We're going to have an opportunity for questions and discussion at the end of our presentation. So without further ado. Okay.
Well, on the behalf of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, I would like to thank you all for offering the opportunity for me to come here today and to talk about a little bit about the work of what Greenhouse Gas Management Institute does and in the context of the whole current climate discussions. I decided I was going to start actually by telling you, and maybe this is not a good idea, but to tell you that I was a little bit nervous about this presentation because I've worked on greenhouse gas inventories for a very long time at this point. I worked at the EPA for over 10 years on the U.S. National Greenhouse Gas Inventory on oil and gas and industrial sources. And as Adil mentioned, I was at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for several years working on inventories. But somehow this idea of remote sensing, it's always a different world to me a little bit. I know that the conversations in the international realm have been going on for a long time. And actually, in the past year, I've been doing more work appreciating the impact and the opportunities for remote sensing to help with inventories. But somehow they're two different communities sometimes. And that's actually, I wanted to admit that because I think that's one of the challenges we face. You have people in the bottom-up world trying to do inventories, whether at the state level, the national level, facility level, and then you have this remote sensing, the top-down. And there's tremendous opportunity there. And it's just, I think, a matter of getting all of the people together and to have these kind of conversations and to look at what the potential is. And so, again, I thank you for the opportunity to present here today. So a little bit about kind of the current climate framework under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there's definitely an enhanced need for measurement, reporting, and verification over the years, from the UN Framework Convention back in the early 1990s until most recently the Paris Agreement. And what you can see is, developed countries have been submitting annual inventories for over 20 years at this point. And the institutions have started to be established. It's relatively regular. They're providing annual submissions. These are being reviewed. Developing countries are providing information a little bit less frequently, but there are a number of inventories out there. They're supposed to be reporting every 4 years in the context of their national communications. Under the Kyoto Protocol, developed countries, they then further enhanced their MRV needs because they had commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. So they not only had to report their greenhouse gas inventories, they had to account for reductions in order to meet their targets. Around 2010, 2011, we had, under the convention, biennial reports to be submitted by developed countries and biennial update reports by developing countries. These were to be submitted every 2 years and include information on greenhouse gas inventories, as well as other additional broader information on policies and measures in the country, targets, and their progress in achieving targets. At this point, the developed countries have been submitting their biennial reports fairly regularly on time. The biennial update reports by developing countries, they were supposed to be submitted first in December 2014, and by now they should be developing their third biennial update report. But if you look at the website, you can see that there's still a great need to help developing countries meet these obligations under the Framework Convention. And then the Paris Agreement will build on the work under the UN Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Paris Agreement, all countries are going to be required to submit their inventories at least biennially, and then also have to report information to track progress on meeting their determined contributions. Every country under the Paris Agreement has made an effort or a contribution to the climate challenge that is appropriate for their national circumstances. And then under these reports, they'll have to report every other year to say whether they're on track to meet these goals. And so all of these reports require significant support, financially, technically, to help the countries estimate their emissions and track their progress. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but I couldn't help it. Working at the UN for years, you just start spouting off decisions all the time and paragraph numbers. But these are the major decisions if you were ever interested on the measurement, reporting, and verification. Starting with the Framework Convention in 1994 up through the Paris Agreement today. I think what's important to note is that under the Paris Agreement, the decision, there's no final decision yet. The negotiators are working internationally now to come up with a rule book. So in terms of what information has to be reported, for both developed and developing countries, how review will take place, how countries will be required to track progress towards meeting their target. All of these discussions are still happening with the goal that the resolution or the final rule book for measurement, reporting, and verification will be finalized in December of this year in Poland. So, as I mentioned in the previous two slides, reporting and review of greenhouse gas inventories has been going on for a long time now. But there's an enhanced need to improve the MRV systems in order to be able to meet the requirements, not only of the Paris Agreement, but really inventories are important for everything. I mean, inventories are important if you're a company trying to look at ways to reduce your emissions, if you're a state looking for ways to improve energy efficiency. So just collecting information on inventories is important regardless of what the end use of the inventory is. But recognizing the enhanced needs, at GHGMI, we worked together with some other international experts, including IGES and some experts from around the world, to think of, what are some of the barriers that are currently existing to helping countries do inventories, and how could we overcome some of those challenges? And in this context, we put together a list of recommendations, a strategy paper about a year and a half ago, I guess, 2 years ago maybe, for the kinds of activities that are needed to reduce the barriers. I won't go through all of these here, but some of the things, some of the highlights that we see and is evident in the programs that we have at the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute are the needs to really build expertise in the country. I think what we find quite often is that when countries are trying to meet their goals or they submit reports, they'll bring in outside consultants and they'll make all of these efforts to produce this one report. And then that gets the job done, but then 2 years later they have the same report again. And so what you really need is to build the capacity in the country to enable them to do it and to build the systems to do it over time. And so a lot of our recommendations are related to building the technical expertise in the country, going beyond government officials to the private sector, training NGOs, training companies, and really trying to broaden the stakeholders that are able to do this kind of work. A little bit about GHGMI. We've been around for about 11 years now, but the people, as an organization, but the people at GHGMI have been doing greenhouse gas inventories, reporting for much longer at this point. This is an amalgamation of several slides, but we think we have our fingers on enhancing training and learners for many people around the world. Some of our programs are related to the the Carbon Institute, which I'll get into in a little bit later, but that's looking at developing academic government partnerships in several countries in Central Africa, Indonesia, and China. And you'll see like some of the products that you work on here with Indonesia, for example, are of great interest to us because we're doing a lot of work in Indonesia with respect to forest carbon monitoring. In addition, we have one of our flagship programs is the 2006 IPCC guidelines courses. We do a lot of online training, and that has experts in several countries enrolled throughout the world. We have GHGMI has a network of an online platform for exchange of information and learners. And then we also do some intensive training. We've done this kind of work in Turkey, Papua New Guinea, several countries in Asia. So all over, when you consider all of the people we've touched, we feel like we have worked with people from nearly every country in the world. I mentioned the 2006 IPCC guidelines. We do a lot of work with training of individuals. The guidelines are the courses, are the guidelines that countries must follow when reporting their national greenhouse gas inventories. So there's a lot of interest. So we have separate courses, for example, on the energy sector, industrial processes, LULUCF, which is land use, management, and forestry, agriculture, waste. We're working on translating these guidelines into French right now to broaden the accessibility to the courses. We hope in the future to be able to also translate these courses into Spanish. The idea is that in developing the courses, we have a rich history of pedagogy and understanding how to teach and to develop kind of interactive exercises so that the students really can walk away having learned the guidelines, not only in theory but in practice, taking real examples so that they can then turn around and go into their current setting and help develop the inventories. And the courses you can see online. There's also, in addition to the 2006 guidelines, we do have several courses on like overall kind of corporate reporting, project level accounting, some project types, coal mining, landfills, energy efficiency for accounting for project reductions. The people we train, I think it's at this point just about every kind of person we've seen come through the door, and that's a reflection of the fact that carbon monitoring, carbon accounting is important in all sorts of walks of life at this point. It's just about everyone. So in addition to the educational online courses, the learning through that process, I also wanted to talk about the Carbon Institute, which is an organization within the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute that is partnering government and academia to really institutionalize the learning in the country. And it's related to the land use change, and forestry sector. It actually started out of a project at the University of California in San Diego, where there's it's a series of courses, I think 145 instructional hours on land use change, and forestry, with the goal that can be tailored towards the country. This is being done in Indonesia, China, Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon now, where they bring together the experts in the country and have a standardized learning, a standardized curriculum for learning the terrestrial carbon accounting. And I think it's been a success thus far. They're going to be running the actual programs in China and Indonesia in the coming months. And the goal, we hope, is to expand this kind of program to other countries and have a real system of accrediting these programs, and to increase the number of stakeholders and people who are able to do this terrestrial carbon accounting throughout the world. you can see these are the 6 courses that are a part of this series, and it's both technical and policy related. So the IPCC guidelines, of course, because they're the fundamental knowledge that all people must have in order to at least for international reporting, to report emissions consistently. But then there's also more specific courses for LULUCF on remote sensing, field methods, statistics, and then importantly, this communication of results as well, because again, one of the challenges is I think you often have 2 different communities, and this is a way to learn how to not only do rigorous studies or rigorous research efforts, but then to be able to communicate the results to others so that others can use those results. Just to mention quickly, Adil gave us a list of the kind of products that your group works on, and I sent these to the members of the Carbon Institute, and I think a lot of what you do is of particular interest to our group, and so I just wanted to list these here. And in addition to these, and the use of Landsat, they use Landsat quite a lot, is that they had an interest or a question as to whether there were any future efforts or planned efforts to work on forest degradation in the Asia and Africa region. That was one area that they were particularly interested in and would be welcome to talk with you further about. So research, another arm or another branch of the work that the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute does is on research. And in particular, one area that we're interested in is monitoring and evaluation of capacity building activities. As I've mentioned a couple times now, there is a long history of issues relating to reporting and review of greenhouse gas inventories. But there's a question that we have to look back and ask ourselves: are they successful? I mean, clearly we're not achieving everything yet because countries aren't able to report at the time frequency that they are obligated to report. So clearly something is missing. And so, we think we need to look back and say what has worked, what has not worked. And, I was telling Adil earlier, I was at the National Geographic Society a couple weeks ago for the release of Resource Watch. And there was a former astronaut there, Dr. Mae Jameson, who was speaking, and she was so inspirational for many reasons. And it was exciting to listen to her. But she was saying, data is not information, information is not knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom. And it's true. You need to not only continue to do these types of activities, but sometimes you have to stop, sit back, and reflect on what has worked and what has not worked. And that's what we're interested in doing. Because the truth is, stronger monitoring and evaluation will lead to stronger capacity building efforts because you're only doing what works, or you're focusing on what works, which then will lead to stronger impact, stronger mitigation and adaptation, which is what the goal is often in the beginning to start with. And so we keep thinking, the key questions, when you come down to it, the key questions that we're trying to answer is, what is capacity building? So what action are you trying to achieve through your intervention? What is your goal? And then once you figure out what is your goal, what are the monitoring and evaluation techniques? How do you know if you've reached your goal? So these are 2 questions that we have been trying to answer. These are questions that I think other fields have been looking at for a long time, like public health. And you think of like interventions to reduce malaria, for example. There's a lot of work out there in the public health field to say what has worked, what has not worked, and to drive action. That similar level of work we don't think has been done really for greenhouse gas measurement, reporting, and verification activities. So in terms of what is capacity building, what kind of change are you trying to achieve? The kinds of things that we look at are, what are the basic skills of the people that are working for you, whether it's just basic statistics skills, for example, or sector skills, applied skills, looking at not only are you aware or informed on the statistics, but can you apply them? Can you develop a greenhouse gas inventory? Can you, do you understand the broader policy context? So applying your basic skills to the field in question. A third element of the capacity building work is motivation. Trying to get at what's driving people to be involved in the field, whether it's a job or getting some type of certificate or monetary. What is the motivation? A fourth element of capacity building is management structure. And this is one that I think is particularly important because I think what we find in greenhouse gas inventories and national systems is that we spend all of this effort training people, and training people, and then they leave. They leave their organization and they go somewhere else. And what is missing is developing the institutions, the background, the archiving systems, the procedures to enable the next person to easily come in and do the same job. So another element of capacity building is working on kind of the management structure, the institutional arrangements. And then finally, resource availability, looking at efficiency, for example. And then how we look at the monitoring and evaluation process, and how to track whether or not we have achieved what we are trying to achieve. It's trying to find the right indicators. Like what are the best indicators of success so that you know that you have achieved what your goal is. So some of the current kinds of indicators could be simple things like the number of people trained, the number of years that they are involved in their work. I think an ultimate indicator is, are they submitting their reports on time? Because truly, even if these national reports, national inventories aren't perfect, it's a system, and it's getting the system in place to improve over time. And I think that's what's critical. So we have transparent information available, which is the bedrock, I think, of the international system. So the last two slides, moving forward, just some ideas for possible discussion that would be interesting to talk with all of you about, is that nowadays there's more and more data at our fingertips, and how do we access it and how do we use it? When I started off the presentation, I was saying, it makes me a little nervous in these discussions on remote sensing, but it's coming up again and again and again, and that's good. That's good. There's so many satellites going up with sensors on them. Data are available. I was looking at the web a couple weeks ago for Global Forest Watch, which is an amazing tool. The Resource Watch, which will expand to other areas. And these are bringing kind of remote sensing data down to people at the inventory level. And I think that's a great thing. And it's just trying to figure out the best way to communicate kind of what kind of data are available and how to use it. Actually, this past year and a half, I was on the committee for the National Academy of Sciences. And it was a methane study, and it was looking at what is our current comfort with the level of methane emissions that's reported in the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory, for example. And the committee brought together people from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, research, university professors from around the world, practitioners from all sectors, many methane sectors, landfills, livestock, coal mining, oil and gas. It brought me there from the policy side doing national greenhouse gas inventories. It had somebody from the company there, a statistician. But what's interesting is that the first couple of days, there was a lot of discussion amongst ourselves just trying to come up with a common language because we have been looking at this issue from very different perspectives for so long. And while we know the other side is out there, it's not often that everyone gets in the same room. And I think that was really a key lesson of that committee, was that just bringing the people together in the same room really is a good start. It's a good start. And so these are some of the things that I thought about based on that study. And actually, one of the other conclusions of that study was there's a need to communicate results effectively because people, I think, are hungry for data. And I know when I worked on the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory, people would use the inventory data for many things beyond which it was originally intended. And that can lead to misunderstandings, confusion, and it's really important to effectively communicate what your numbers mean and what they don't mean, and what they can be used for. And finally, I know others at GHGMI have talked with maybe some of you in the past about opportunities for producing some kind of joint article. I mean, that's or a blog post or a newsletter or something. as another way of kind of bringing these two communities together. Some things we were thinking about, the state of remote sensing, like how remote sensing could be used for greenhouse gas inventory applications. Actually, I've been working on a little bit on a side project the past couple of months and looking at Landsat imagery. And for me, this was a first, but it was really fascinating to see, like, you really can see changes. And I think that's exciting. And it's, you can see the changes in land cover. And you really can start, internalizing kind of what's going on out there. And it makes remote sensing a little bit more internal. And it's been an interesting project. And I think those kinds of things would be helpful for people in the inventory community to see really what is the potential for remote sensing to help with inventory. Maybe like where is remote sensing going? Is there an opportunity to like improve the resolution of images so that we could do other things? I'm seeing it come up more and more. Actually, there was a study a couple weeks ago released on from WRI, I think, on power plants and using a variety of different data sets to talk about where the power plants are and to try to get a global database on power plants. Again, bringing this information down to people to see what's in their backyard and then motivate them to do things and to learn more. So I think it's really interesting. A question I had is, I think actually one more point on that actually is that I think the international community is also really, I think, looking more and more towards remote sensing. I had mentioned that the 2006 IPCC guidelines are kind of the baseline guidelines that everyone uses right now, and that's true. But the international community is also in the process of refining those 2006 IPCC guidelines to provide additional clarification and guidance on what is already in there. And one of the things that is being added, at least according to the terms of reference online, is a section on remote sensing. So that, I think, is the first time that remote sensing is really explicitly, several pages. It's the first time it's explicitly in there. So I think that will be something interesting to watch as those guidelines are finalized. But it is in the terms of reference. Another area that could be interesting to think about is how remote sensing could help with verifying the tracking of the nationally determined contributions. So these are the things that countries are doing in the context of the Paris Agreement. So that's one option, or looking at the remote sensing for the use of activity data, for example, for the LULUCF sector. I've seen cases or heard of cases where corporations are using satellite data to verify their supply chain, so where their products or their inputs are coming from. And then another area, and this final bullet point is coming from my experience on the National Academies of Sciences study in the past year, is how to use top-down and bottom-up data to improve the accuracy of emissions. One thing that was seen, particularly in the oil and gas sector, was if you look at top-down studies, the emissions are quite high or are higher than the bottom-up studies. And so the question is, which it leads to the questions about the accuracy of the estimates. The bottom-up studies are likely missing some emissions. The top-down studies, you have to struggle with the separation of the anthropogenic and the natural methane emissions. But the point is that these kind of studies can be done, and then you can start targeting where to improve the accuracy of your estimates. And I think that's a really exciting one to look at, and it's something that was another one of the recommendations in the National Academies of Sciences report. So I think that's it. That's the kind of the work that the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute has been doing. Some of the thoughts for us, hopefully being able to collaborate further in the coming months. Thank you. It's very possible because I am not one who has done a lot on field methods. I mean, I could come back to you on the actual specific content of the courses for the Carbon Institute on the field methods. But yeah, it's not something that, yeah. So if they were used differently, it is not intentional. So, yeah. Okay, I can actually get back to you on that. Yeah. So do we. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is an emissions inventory conference that I think still happens every year. That's actually run by, I think, OATPS, the EPA, one of the EPA's offices. I mean, that's one where I think it's pretty much open to anyone. But you're absolutely right, and these were some of the recommendations that came out of the National Academy study. I think Massacres and a group from Harvard did a gridded inventory a couple of years ago, and it used the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory from EPA as kind of a these are the total emissions, and it tried to use other top-down modeling to come up with a gridded, very spatially discrete inventory that could be used for multiple purposes. And it was eye-opening to me in the study just how well received it was and how necessary the people in the top-down world thought it was to be able to verify kind of what they were seeing. And those kinds of things I think should happen more frequently. What is the best venue? It may not exist yet, because actually another recommendation of the study of the National Academies was that we need some type of really kind of advisory group that brings in together not only government but also universities and from across these sectors to have these very discussions and to figure out like at what is the point that this type of information could then get incorporated into the inventory. Yeah, I'm not sure it really exists yet. So.
Yes, yes. Okay, I sent a note on the chat line. I think if you would please share with our speaker the reference that I included, which is to an article that appeared in the Medical Bulletin, World Meteorological Organization Bulletin last year, where I gave an overview of the WMO and United Nations Environment Program initiative called the Integrated Global Greenhouse Gas Information System, which is an effort to bring to bear on this issue of including estimates of emissions of greenhouse gases, to bring to bear the use of measurements in general, not just the most sensitive, but concentration measurements in the atmosphere that are derived from all kinds of sensors, both in situ and remote sensing. And then, of course, as our speaker mentioned, through this initiative, we were able to engage with the IPCC task force on inventory, who are, as you mentioned, developing an update that will be released in 2019 to their 2006 guidelines. And there is a very robust section that do. And again, it's not just the most sensing that the bottom-up activity information as well, as she pointed out. But I just wanted to add to the mix of takeaways from this very nice presentation. This activity that I just described as a reference that people can get later with it and from an overview perspective, and that I would be happy to discuss afterwards any of the details and look forward to discussion and potential collaboration.
Yeah, actually, in preparing for this presentation, I had seen something on the, is it IG3S or, yeah, and I saw that Kyoto Tanabe from the IPCC, I think, was on there, and I think I was not as familiar with it, and so I didn't present it, but yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, Kyoto Tanabe, who's one of the co-chairs for the IPCC nearby, is familiar with it, and for the 2019 update to the 2000 guidelines, there were two lead authors who were working on that new section that will be included in the update, and they are actually members of our science team for this initiative. So that's Shamo Matsuda from the National Institute for Environmental Science in Japan, and Huangqi Feng from the Chinese Meteorological Service in Beijing. And they are actually the authors working on that, and they're members of our science team for the initiative.
Great.
Thank you. We have a question online. Can we share the link with the people that are online?
I can resend what I sent to you, and I'll do everyone online.
Okay, sure.
And or you
I can do it.
You know, that's a very good question. I'm sure it's very specific. Whether our team has interest, I'm pretty sure yes, because one of the team members on the Carbon Institute has done a lot of work in the past on LiDAR, and I think he sees a lot of potential and opportunities with using LiDAR data. Broadly, I think this question of forest degradation is very difficult. How do you define forest degradation, and how do you see degradation happening is a key issue on the international front as well. So I think this is something that we could talk about further. Am I able to see those questions as well so that I can then convey that specifically? Yeah, that would be great. Okay. They're not for free. There's a charge associated with them. You can go online. So here is the URL for the access to the courses. Again, with the 2006 guidelines courses, we generally recommend that you take two of the courses. One is the general introduction that looks at kind of the cross-cutting issues about time series consistency, collecting data, uncertainty analysis, QA/QC, the general how to do an inventory, and then a specific sector course. So all of those courses are now available online and in English. In French, we have the cross-cutting and the energy sector also available.
And you were asking about
yeah.
And one thing that we do is that I can make sure we have programs here at Hanle that and they do like more of the same way that we're doing
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah. Ah, okay. Okay. Yeah. Great. Actually, and one other thing that I didn't mention on mine is that there's this consultative group of experts it's an international group coming out of the UN, but they're also very interested in capacity building efforts. And they host a lot of webinars and training and, like you were saying, best practices for capacity building. And lately they've been, it seems, particularly interested in LULUCF related issues. There was a webinar about a month ago on collector, and last week they were looking at uncertainty in LULUCF. So yeah, definitely it would be interesting to talk with you further on this ARCID. And then there's a broader international effort for capacity building as well.
Is there any questions?
Yeah. This is Peter Brooks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
We hear you, Peter.
Okay, good. Lisa, sorry that I'm not present in the room for this. I'm the project manager for the carbon monitoring system projects. I was thinking it might be good to speak with you and maybe with George first if you had a chance to talk with George first.
No. So it's a
Yeah, I think maybe a follow-up
okay.
would be useful. We have a couple of things in mind for the current set of carbon monitoring system projects, which the most recent group still has almost 3 years of funding left. And moving into some more of integration of results and some synthesis activities across the funded investigations. And I think some engagement with your kind of stakeholder needs expressed would be interesting for that. We have a session that we proposed. I suspect it will be part of the AGU program when American Geophysical Union meets in DC this fall on carbon monitoring systems writ large, not just the narrow focus of massive activity in that. So you might be interested in participating in that.
Yeah.
And we also anticipate having a future science team meeting for NASA's prototyping activities on carbon monitoring systems, probably in the February timeframe, but the date is not set on that.
Yeah.
And we would be looking for some stakeholder. From our point of view, you're a stakeholder.
Great, thank you.
Engagements. You mentioned a couple of upcoming satellite missions, or at least the fact that the satellite observations occur. There's a mission called JEDI, G-E-D-I, that I think for the interest in tropical deforestation would be very interesting for your community. There's something else called GeoCard that will be having named observations of North and South America, total column CO2 that will help the space station. I know in geosynchronous orbit in a couple of years. So there's definitely some upcoming missions as well as the long-term historical activity like what's happening with what you can get from Landsat.
Right. Thank you. That's good. I've taken notes of all of those. Thank you.
What I would do, I'll send a follow-up email to you here first,
Perfect. Thank you. Great. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but is there, how much emphasis is there in the training on reporting uncertainties in the numbers as well as the kind of best estimates?
It's certainly an emphasis. I mean, there's a whole volume in the 2006 guidelines devoted to uncertainty and how to calculate uncertainty, how to get underlying data to calculate uncertainty. And so it is a component of the training in terms of how to do the calculations and how to collect the data. Honestly, from what I've seen, because one of my jobs at the UN was coordinating reviews of developed countries' inventories, and I think what you see a lot is countries are still using the default uncertainty values that are in the 2006 IPCC guidelines. I mean, there's many exceptions, and some countries are very different, but I think a lot of people still use just the default uncertainty values that are in the 2006 guidelines for these types of calculations. I think we always think of uncertainty as an important element to help kind of prioritize where you should improve your inventory. So looking at those sources that are not only large sources of emissions, but also have significant uncertainty. I think in practice, uncertainty is sort of the second thing that you do after you really work on your inventory. But there is an emphasis and there is an element of the training related to uncertainty.
Okay. I can see uncertainty also playing an important role in trying to monitor trends in emissions from different countries. I guess if the underlying numbers are uncertain enough, then the trends can be even more uncertain. So it's very hard to determine.
Right. And I think a lot of the work that the sectors that you are working on are the ones where the uncertainty is quite large, are relatively large. Energy is pretty well known right now, but when you look at LULUCF or agricultural soils, for example, the uncertainty is a lot higher. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming here. Thank you everyone who was on the call. And I just wanted to let you know we have one more spot this week. We are going to have Warren Fletcher. He used to work at NASA for 10 years. He's the CEO and founder of the company Biocarbon Engineering that is based in Oxford, England. He's coming from London. And he's going to be presenting these new tree planting drone technology for global scale ecosystem restoration. They're doing a lot of very exciting, very interesting projects in ecosystem restoration around the world, especially in Southeast Asia. So he's going to be on Friday. He's going to be on the other conference room, the 133. So please, if you can, come to attend. And thank you, Lisa, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you very much.